Alright, history pookies of light metal. It's your day today. We start today's auspicious day with a hardcore war story. Just a little something that may trigger some involuntary release of H2O content in your undergarments. Are you ready to rock and roll?
Aye, Captain!
With road tax and toll?
Neighbor!
Let's begin. This happened 930 years ago. The European Crusader armies finally came face to face with warriors from the Islamic world. But wait, they realized very quickly that something was not adding up. The Europeans were absolutely stunned by the quality of their enemy's swords. After days of brutal fighting, these legendary blades still held their edge like it was just another day at the office. Warriors later claimed these swords could slice a falling silk scarf mid-air like Fruit Ninja. This part might have been exaggerated, but it does tell you how mythical their reputation was. This steel was none other than Damascus steel, named after the city where the Crusaders encountered it. But here's the part most people don't know. The steel itself did not come from Damascus. It came from India. These blades were forged from wood steel, which was produced in parts of what is today Karnataka and Tamil Nadu. Local blacksmiths called it ukku. It literally meant steel in Kannada and Telugu. But for the Brits, as usual, this was a word way too complicated to pronounce, so they just called it woods. I'm not even kidding, that is literally how this steel got its anglicized name in the 1800s. And to think we allowed these guys to rule us for 200 years. Real mind-blowing stuff. Okay, so just how good was woods? Apparently, we built solid cast chunks of this steel called ingots that were exported to the Middle East, where it was called Hindwani steel. The Romans called it Ceric steel, meaning iron from the east. In fact, when Alexander reached the northwestern edge of India, historical records show he did not just take back gold and silver, he took Indian steel and the knowledge behind it. You see, this is just one example of how Made in India was once a global marker of excellence and quality. In many ways, India was, 1,000 years ago, what Japan is today. So, what happened? How did we go from an innovation powerhouse to a country whose biggest selling point is cheap labor? Where international companies come, not because we're the best, but because we're the cheapest place to do things they wouldn't dare do back home. How did we fall this hard from grace? Let's break it down. Think about any country that thrived throughout history and then was completely ruined. Now try to guess who might be responsible for it.
Right.
Yes, it was these guys. In fact, India is the biggest example of how it takes barely a couple of centuries to ruin thousands of years of progress. The Brits came to India to do one thing and one thing only, to enrich themselves. And that's pretty much what they've been doing ever since they started leaving their homeland. The best part is that they never stopped. In fact, other like-minded countries joined them. Every part of the world that wasn't somewhat white, it's the same story. It's just that some of us were a little better at kicking them out. Before colonial rule, India accounted for an estimated 27% of global GDP, roughly comparable to all of Europe combined. Yes, combined. By the time the British left, that number had collapsed to 4%. I don't let my phone's battery collapse to 4%. Indian cotton and silk were globally prized. British policy imposed tariffs on Indian textiles while flooding the Indian market with cheap, machine-made British cloth. Local craftsmen couldn't compete. After years of slow decline, they were eventually wiped out of existence. The economy was deliberately restructured so India could supply raw materials while Britain sold finished goods back to India at a profit. Now the thing is, Indian artisans didn't just rely on markets. They relied on patronage from royal courts and support from guilds. The British dismantled these systems and redirected patronage toward art and trade that suited British tastes. And British taste, honestly, the less I say the better. By the time the British left, India was impoverished, food insecure, and exhausted. Building world-class industries wasn't even on the priority list. And then came the partition, a border drawn by a British lawyer who had never been to India before. Like ever. He was given like 37 days to split an entire subcontinent. Supply chains collapsed overnight. Raw materials to one country, factories to another. It was complete chaos. Like, I don't even have a joke there. It was hands down the biggest mess up in the history of mess ups ever. It was at best an extremely careless move, and at worst done with the intention of kicking us in the groins one last time so that we would never be able to get back up. This long period of scarcity left a deep psychological scar. In an environment like that, quality took the back seat. In fact, it wasn't even in the car. Independence was the end of one struggle and the beginning of another. A century-worth load of systematic extraction had left India economically weakened, industrially thin, and still at the mercy of the West. Most of the population lived in villages and depended on agriculture. Electricity hadn't reached most of them. Partition had severely disrupted industries like textiles by splitting raw material sources in factories across borders. Millions were displaced, living in refugee camps, needing jobs, food, and basic necessities. Public infrastructure like railways, bridges, ports were worn down and under capacity. Energy sources like coal and power generation needed urgent expansion. And all of this required steel, cement, tools, locomotives. Now, under the British rule, this wasn't really a problem because they took care of it. I mean, they were doing it for themselves, so obviously they took care of it. But now, it was our problem. And these essential commodities, either we didn't make them at all, or even if we did, it was nowhere near enough to feed the demand. So we had to import them. But even that could do only so much because foreign reserves were tight. We were literally importing food. It was so bad that the per capita calorie intake was among the lowest in the world at the time. The whole country was basically put on a keto diet. Cement and steel production fell dramatically short of national requirements, even with the factories running 24/7. The government had to ration these materials, which delayed or shut down many infrastructure projects. Even bicycles, which, if you know, at the time were the most important mode of commute, we were only able to produce about 1.5 million while the demand was a whopping 4 million. The 6 boomers watching this video can testify to the fact that you couldn't just walk into a store and buy a bicycle. You literally had to apply for a permit to the government and wait anywhere between 6 months to a year. Just imagine waiting 1 year for a bicycle. That's how bad things were. When you're rebuilding a country that is not even producing enough food to feed its people, much less manufacturing enough daily necessities for millions of people who barely made enough money to buy their next meal, you're not thinking of world-class quality or user experience. You're not even thinking in that general direction. You just want to push out as many units as possible in as little time as possible for as cheap as possible. And that's exactly what we did. That mindset started in essential industries and then became a habit. Hindustan Motors ran machinery from the 1950s well into the 2000s. The Ambassador was shipped with misaligned doors, paint defects, rattling dashboards, and nobody cared. Production targets were met, many defects were fixed at the dealerships. Bajaj scooters. Some of you millennials might remember stories your parents told you about just how long they had to wait to get one of these. People didn't care how smooth they were or how premium they felt as long as they worked. And add to this the license Raj. The state tightly controlled capacity, pricing, and access to raw materials. I mean, it makes sense, right? Because there are more important uses for steel than making cars less than 1% of the people can afford. And foreign investment was minimal. There were like 2 car companies, 3 scooter companies, and 2 tractor companies.
So like 6 or 7 companies?
This was barely a competition. This was a 100-meter sprint between 3 runners running under the same country's flag. There was no incentive to innovate or improve quality. And then came 1991, the year that changed everything. India liberalized its economy and opened its doors to the world. All thanks to this guy. Honestly, I think we were a little too harsh with him. Not her, but him, yeah. Anyway, he is the reason Tata and Mahindra even try to give you a crumb of value for your money. Otherwise, they were doing completely fine just putting a metal box on 4 wheels and calling it a car. He was the reason the world's top car companies were able to come to India and start making and selling their cars here. But once they did, it turned out to be a complete nightmare to get them to stick to the same quality standards they followed everywhere else. You see, a foreign company can't just walk into India, build a factory and start selling cars. This is not vada pav.
Give it to me! Give it to me!
Liberalization did make it easier to set up shop in India, but the government still used tariffs and policy incentives to push companies toward localizing their supply chain. And even without the tariffs, localization just makes economic sense. You don't want to import every nut and bolt holding your car together. That's how the auto industry works globally. Car companies outsource roughly 80 to 90% of their parts to suppliers, which means a massive portion of the car's real-world quality and reliability is determined outside the OEM's factory. And that is where the problems began. Many local suppliers simply did not have the capability to consistently meet global quality standards. Now, faced with this reality, OEMs often had to make uncomfortable trade-offs, temporarily relaxing certain tolerances or specifications just to keep production running, while also trying to upgrade supplier capability over time. But there's only so much an OEM can do, which brings us to an interesting concept I like to call the nucleus of quality. Every OEM consciously defines a quality standard it wants to uphold for its customers. Inside its own factory, it does everything possible to meet that standard. Control plans, inspections, procedures, checks, threats, standard capitalism stuff. But it doesn't make most of its parts in-house. So it tries to influence how suppliers manage their side of the quality. Detailed specifications, tolerances, procedures, sometimes even providing inspection gauges. There are audits, scheduled audits, where the supplier has ample time to make their factory not look like a war zone. And then there are surprise audits, where the reception deliberately takes forever to check the customer in so that the manager can run to the shop floor and ask everyone to wear their safety glasses and act like happy human beings. Still, the OEM never has the same level of control inside a supplier's factory as it does inside its own. And this problem multiplies down the supply chain. Tier 1 suppliers have their own Tier 2 suppliers. They, in turn, rely on Tier 3 suppliers. With each step, the control weakens. Now imagine this. A Tier 3 supplier with loose processes ships a bad part. This part passes through Tier 2 and then Tier 1 and eventually ends up in the OEM's factory. And finally, in your car. Mind you, none of these factories inspect 100% of incoming parts. It's just simply not feasible. So even when systems were designed with the best intentions in mind, failures still slip through, and the customer ends up paying for it. That's why the OEM becomes the nucleus of quality. The closer a process or part is to this nucleus, the easier it is to control. Further away it gets, the harder quality becomes to enforce. And now for the last and possibly the most important piece of the puzzle. Humans. Let's take a step back to a time before the Industrial Revolution. Before work was reduced to just job titles, KPIs and headcounts. When a trade wasn't just something you did to survive, but something you were. Textiles, metalwork, architecture, shipbuilding, mathematics, art. In fact, many of you watching this video still carry surnames that were once professions. That wasn't accidental. That was pride. That was identity. That was the dignity of labor. Do we have that today? How many car mechanics do you know who would proudly want their children to also become car mechanics? How many factory workers, machinists, welders, toolmakers, technicians want to pass their craft on to the next generation? Not many. And can you really blame them? The people who actually build the cars we obsess over are closest to the process. They see the problems first. They hear the noises before anyone else. And yet they are overworked, underpaid, rushed and told to just make it work. When production targets matter more than feedback, people stop caring. You cannot inspect quality into a product if the people building it don't feel ownership over it. In countries that consistently produce world-class quality, workers are not treated as disposable. They are trained deeply, they are respected, they are listened to, they are allowed, in fact even expected to stop the line when something feels off. Quality there is not enforced, it is owned. I agree, Japanese companies brought their world-class quality philosophies to India. Procedures, audits, training programs, manuals thicker than the phone book. But here's the thing, you can train procedures all you want, but you cannot train mindset. We've all seen this. A big audit is coming, senior leadership is visiting, suddenly the factory is spotless, charts are updated, safety shoes appear overnight. The moment the audit team leaves, things quietly go back to how they were. And senior management goes back home wondering why the customers are complaining so much when everything at the factory is working perfectly. And before we point fingers only at the factories and companies, ask yourself something honestly. And be honest here. How much integrity do you bring to your work? Have you ever cut a corner because it was faster? Skipped a step because it'll probably be fine? Delivered something that wasn't your best because no one would notice? Most of us have. I mean, with ChatGPT and everything. Now imagine your car mechanic thinking like that. Imagine the person torquing your suspension bolts thinking like that. Imagine the person assembling your brakes thinking like that. A modern car isn't just built in one factory. It is also built by hundreds of suppliers and their suppliers and their suppliers. Do we really believe the same culture of quality exists at every level of that pyramid? quality doesn't fail at the factory gate. It fails much earlier in how a society values work itself. Because in the end, machines don't care, processes don't care, audits don't care, people do. And quality is everybody's job. And as the great John F. Kennedy said, ask not what light metal can do for you, ask what you can do for light metal. And what you can do is watch this video to know how you can be a better rider on Indian roads. Oh wait, that video was taken down.
But don't worry, Babu. Zook got our back. See first link in the description.
Thank you for watching. If you like this video, give it a thumbs up and subscribe for more content like this. See you in the next video.
Oh guys, looking this side rainwater and this side also rainwater. Middle of me. Mali ado bolka guys. Water, there is something water. Oh, actually I'm a black boy.